Welcome back to Murder in the Black. It is your host, Steph. Can you guys believe that we're in the middle of October? We're finally wrapping up season 8. And it's that time of year when the aisles are split, pumpkins on one side and Christmas trees on the other. They're always shoving us into holidays, not really allowing us time to really enjoy the holidays we're in. I hate it. But for many, the holidays mean joy, good food, and time with family. But for others, it's the season when heartbreak knocks on the door, when a celebration turns into tragedy you never saw coming. So as you listen to today's story, let it be a reminder to hold your loved ones close and never miss a chance to tell them you love them. Now let's get into our true crime case for today. Grab your coffee if it's the morning, your lemonade if it's the afternoon, but most certainly grab your wine if it's the evening. Either way, let's get into it. December 19th, 1992, West Harlem, New York. The holiday season was in full swing. Lights shimmered from apartment windows. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted down 125th Street. But inside one Harlem apartment, the scene was anything but joyful. A landlord had come to investigate a complaint. A tenant reported water leaking from their ceiling. When he knocked on the door of the tenant who was responsible for the leaking, there was no answer. And oddly, he didn't have a key to the unit. And why didn't he have one? He didn't want to knock down the door, break it down. He simply decided to gain entrance through the fire escape, or at the very least, get the tenant's attention to let him inside. But when he got out there, he looked through the window and he saw something that made him stop hold. There was a woman lying on the bed, motionless, with a comforter or pillow covering their face. He knocked on the door to get their attention, but she didn't move. And he didn't know what to do other than to call 911 and EMT to figure out what took place in this apartment. Police officers arrived and they broke the door down. What they discovered would haunt them forever. 2 young women, both murdered. The crime, brutal, intimate, and unthinkable. The first victim was found in the bedroom, and they noticed that in the way that she was positioned on the bed, they believed that she had been sexually assaulted. They noticed bruising on her neck, which made them believe that she had been strangled, but they had no way to prove that and would have to wait on autopsy results. When they entered the bathroom, they found the second victim lying in a tub filled with water, and there were signs of a struggle. The victim appeared to have fought back. And as a result of her fighting back, there was a pipe that was dislodged, causing the leak. That was the initial reason why the landlord came to the apartment in the first place. They also believed that she was strangled because there was a cord found around her neck. The 2 women in the apartment were identified. Their names were Nikki Silas and Brittany Rojas. The victim found in the bedroom was identified as Nikki, who was 20 years old. She was mixed race, but many people described her as the Black Marilyn Monroe. She was that pretty. She had moved from Massachusetts to New York to attend Pace University. She was magnetic, full of personality, and was determined to make it big as a dancer. She already performed in music videos, including one for Mariah Carey, and dreamed of dancing in movies and on world stages. Brittany Rojas was 19. She was Dominican and grew up in Queens, New York. She and Nikki became fast friends because both women were chasing their dreams in a city that promised everything. However, that night, those dreams ended violently, and detectives desperately wanted to figure out why these 2 young women were violently murdered in their homes. They went around the apartment, securing the crime scene, bagging evidence, and inside of the bedroom with Nikki, they discovered a handwritten note that described directions on how to find the apartment. They looked around and the apartment itself looked ransacked, and it wasn't clear if there was a robbery because they didn't know what items were in the apartment and what wasn't. But they knew that robbery could have been a motive. And so they had a couple of working theories as they began to make their way throughout the crime scene. They then discovered some mail. It was from Rikers Island and it was addressed to Brittany. As I said, it's working theories. They're trying to figure things out as they go along. And it raised the new question. Had someone just been released from Rikers Island and they came looking for revenge? And as a result, Brittany was killed and Nikki was too, simply because she was there. Now, detectives needed to dig further into these women's lives, but one of the first things they needed to do was canvass the area. They needed to talk to the tenants in the apartment. And they were pretty confident that the tenants heard something because there was such a violent struggle that took place in the bathroom that they knew more than likely they either heard some screaming or they heard some items going back and forth. But when they talked to the tenants, all of the tenants said they didn't hear anything unusual that night coming from Brittany and Nikki's apartment. They heard no screaming and they heard no items being pushed around and slammed to the floor. Mystified, police didn't know really what to think about the tenants not hearing anything, but they continued to look further. And one of the first things they did after securing the crime scene and bagging evidence was to reach out to the phone company because Brittany and Nikki did have a home line in their apartment. They asked the phone company for their phone logs, and it is the 90s. And so, of course, this would be a slow process. But to be honest, we've talked about in great length that it's a slow process securing warrants to get phone logs of cell phone data. But it was particularly slow here because there was a kidnapping case that was taking place at the same time of Brittany and Nikki's homicide. And so the process was going to be even slower because the main priority at that time was to get the child back in this kidnapping case. So the phone company was busy assisting with that. It was going to take time. That wasn't the hardest part for investigators. They had to notify Brittany Rojas and Nikki Silas' family of their murder just days before Christmas. Both families were completely devastated, and Brittany's family was local, so it didn't take them a lot of time getting down to the morgue to identify Brittany's body. But Nikki's mother had to fly out to New York City from Massachusetts on December 20th. One of the things that I found particularly interesting about this case is that the detectives were so moved by this homicide that after the families identified the bodies of their loved ones, they made a promise to both families that they would find who was responsible for Brittany and Nikki's death and bring them to justice. I have to tell you that I think that on some level, maybe that was irresponsible, but I truly do applaud both detectives on the case for making such a promise. Because oftentimes when you think about detectives, you know that they experience death on such a large platform and they experience it daily. You know, they interact with it far more than we do in the general public. But to know that there are cases that just make such an indelible mark on their heart, that they feel the pressure to make a commitment as big as this is laudable, honestly. And I also think that on some level, it could be irresponsible only because the family is at such a vulnerable state. So to hear law enforcement make a promise that, to be honest, they don't know if they'll be able to fulfill only can add to the grief if they're unable to bring that promise to fruition. However, in this case, I think that it was kind, but also was enough pressure for detectives to really be inspired to get the answers for the family. Now, Mrs. Silas, Nikki's mother, wanted to let detectives know a little bit about her daughter and what was going on in her life leading up to her murder. She claimed that Nikki had an on and off again boyfriend named Cooley, and she indicated that there was physical abuse in their relationship. She claimed that recently Nikki called her and informed her that rent was just too high and that her and Brittany were unable to afford it. So she needed to move back home to Massachusetts for a time. And her mother said, "That's fine. You're welcome to come back. But I want you to know that I don't think you should tell Cooley that you're moving back. Because y'all's relationship is filled with so much tension, I don't know if that would set him off and lead him to abuse you because you'll be leaving New York. Police thought this to be a very good lead, and they looked into Cooley to find out he recently had an arrest warrant for attempting to rape his cousin. Knowing that he had physically abused Nikki, and then he also had this pending attempted rape on his own cousin, they knew they needed to talk to Cooley, but they had to track him down. In the meantime, the autopsy results came back for both women. And it was what they believed in the first place, that both women had been strangled, but they had been strangled in different ways. Nikki had been strangled manually, and Brittany had been strangled via a phone cord. Nikki also was raped, and they conducted a rape kit on her, and they were able to recover the DNA on Nikki's body. And they hoped to use that DNA found so that they could run it through CODIS in attempt to find out who the perpetrator was. Now, as the investigators are looking for Cooley, they end up going back to Brittany and Nikki's apartment. And they find a man named Daniel who was in the front of the building. And of course, they query him. They ask him some questions. Did you know Brittany? Did you know Nikki? And they find out that Daniel was familiar to law enforcement. Daniel actually was the local drug dealer who pretty much stayed in the front of the building and sold drugs. But Daniel was a likable guy. And they found out that Daniel knew Nikki. They often would speak as she would go in and out of the building. And when he found out that Nikki and Brittany had been killed, he was willing to cooperate with investigators despite them knowing that he sold drugs. And they willingly told him, listen, we're not interested in you dealing drugs. We're trying to find out information about Nikki and Brittany. They spoke to him about the night in question. And he said that he saw two men that night who looked like they didn't belong, and they came out of Brittany and Nikki's apartment. He claimed that one man came out of the apartment without the other, and he seemed visibly distraught. He had his hands over his face. And about 5 to 10 minutes later, another man came out carrying a box underneath his arm. And he remembered that this guy had a Christmas hat on. Now, he thought that was a little unusual in a sense, but not really because it was Christmas time. But he just said that he paid attention to both men closely. So they asked Daniel, would you come down to the station and be willing to work with our sketch artists to look for these potential suspects? And Daniel fully cooperated. They were able to get a full sketch of one of the men because he was kind of questionable about the first man that came out, but the second man with the Christmas hat, he had really good details. So they were able to capture the sketch, and they released Daniel pending if they needed more information in the days to come. They eventually do locate Cooley. They brought him down, and they were the ones that revealed to him that Nikki had been killed in her apartment along with Brittany. Now, he seemed visibly upset. He was crying and was distraught upon hearing about the passing of both women. He claimed that the last time he saw Nikki was when they went to dinner a couple of days prior. So they didn't know if he was responsible or not. But since Daniel got a good look at the two male victims, they thought that if it was Cooley, they could have him participate in a lineup. So they bring Daniel back, and they had Cooley stand up in addition to other people. And Daniel was unable to identify him as the man that he saw on the night of the murders. They sat Cooley back down and they said, hey, listen, our witness was unable to identify you as the person they saw. And while this doesn't free you as a suspect, at this time, we have no evidence to hold you. And so we're willing to release you pending we need more information if it comes back up. But Cooley actually gave them more information. He claimed that Nikki and Brittany worked at a place called Show World down in Times Square. Show World was a strip club, and it was more the old school strip club. Women performed behind a curtain, and the curtain would be lifted based on men putting money in a machine, right? So, very old school. And both women, as we already know, were having problems keeping up with rent at the time. So they needed to work at a place that would provide quick cash. And that's what Show World did. But it wasn't just the quick cash part of Show World that made it appealing to both women. Actually, we know that strip clubs is a place where a lot of people in the entertainment industry would come and recruit talent. So not only did it have financial gain for Brittany and Nikki, but it had entertainment opportunities as well. The detectives equipped with this new information find it to be a very promising, and they go down to Show World to talk to the women that work there to get more information. But we know in the strip club industry and out on the streets, talking to police is just not something that you do. They had a hard time pinning down anybody to get information, but one woman eventually did come forward and offer information that was pertinent to the investigation. She claimed that Brittany was seeing a man named Felix Perla. Now, she indicated that Brittany never dated him, but Felix would come down to the strip club just to see Brittany. And he would often ask Brittany to spend time with him. And Brittany said, the only way that I'll spend time with you is if you pay me to spend time with you. Because if I'm not at the strip club making money, then that means I'm not making money. So he would often exchange the money that she would make at the strip club for her time. He would pay her $300. Now, none of the dancers knew where Felix lived, so this left investigators in a quandary. They had to stake out the strip club in hopes that they would see Felix and track him down to bring him in for questioning. And eventually, they did. They located him and they brought him back down to the police station. In the interview, he maintained that he didn't know who killed Brittany or Nikki and claimed that the last time he saw Brittany is when he took her out and paid her money in exchange for her time. Now, I want to make it clear that when Cooley was interviewed, they did take DNA from him because they needed it to compare it to the DNA found in Nikki's rape kit. And when they talked to Felix, they also took his DNA as well. Felix had an alibi that police had to check out. But it was during this interview with Felix that he mentioned something that they had been hearing throughout the interview when they were talking to Cooley, when they were talking to other friends and family members. Felix revealed that there was a safe in the home with both women. He claimed that Nikki and Brittany saved up about $14,000 that they were planning to split amongst themselves and go their separate ways because the rent was getting to be too high. And when they heard this, they couldn't find the safe, so they believed that the robbery theory, there was something to that, but they couldn't confirm it. But they made note that there was this safe that kept being mentioned, and Felix gave more information. Now, there was no evidence that tied Felix to the murder, so ultimately they did allow him to go. The detectives, although they had very promising suspects, there wasn't enough to tie either Cooley or Felix to the murder of Brittany and Nikki. So they still needed more information. As I said previously, Nikki was scheduled to return to Massachusetts in the following days. And to be exact, she was going to arrive on the 22nd. However, she didn't. And it was her body that arrived on that date instead. Her funeral was held on Christmas Eve, and her family endured the tragedy during the holiday. Detectives finally received the DNA results from Cooley and Felix that were compared to Nikki's rape kit. And both men were cleared as suspects. Police then obtained a warrant to open the mail from Rikers Island that was addressed to Brittany, and they found the person Brittany was writing to was her boyfriend. And unfortunately, it was the police that told him that Brittany had been murdered. Now, he offered up some information. He claimed that Brittany had been spending some time with some rappers and some industry figures, and he thought that was worth police investigating. And when detectives went and spoke to the rappers, they claimed that they did, in fact, know Brittany and knew who Nikki was, but they had seen her outside of the club weeks prior to her death. But at the time of the murder, they were on tour and their alibi was substantiated. Once again, detectives were left at zero with not any clear indication on who was involved with Nikki and Brittany's murder. The phone company finally got back with detectives and revealed the phone records of Brittany and Nikki on the night of their murders. There was a call that was made from their apartment to a couple named Derek and Sydney Culver. They lived in Queens. And this phone call was made at 1 a.m. on the night of the murder, which investigators believe that this was around the time Brittany and Nikki were murdered. Investigators went to Queens to talk to the couple, and they admitted that they did receive a phone call on December 19th. And they said that it was from their friend, Antoine Atterbury. He was 22 years old, basketball player who played at the Manhattan Community College. They said they weren't at home when he placed that phone call. However, he did leave a voicemail. They said that he seemed very distraught. He was crying. And when they got back to their apartment and received the voicemail, they called him the next day because they were concerned. He played it off. He acted as if nothing was wrong with him and he was okay. He simply said that he had been locked out of his apartment. So investigators knew they needed to speak to Antoine. But before they left, Derek and Sydney said that Antoine was not a guy who had a criminal past. He was a good kid. And they thought he was, and they believed that investigators were simply barking up the wrong tree. When they arrived at Antoine's apartment, they noticed that he seemed to be very calm and cooperative, but he denied knowing Brittany or Nikki or being at their apartment. And he denied it so well that detectives really did believe that maybe the Culvers were on the right track, that they had the wrong guy. As they continued to talk to Antoine, they began to look around his apartment and they noticed a safe matching the description of the one missing from Brittany's room. The same safe that Felix had talked about in his interview that contained about $14,000. And when they confronted Antoine with this information, he admitted that he was in Brittany and Nikki's apartment with his roommate, Kevin Ladison. He claimed that he was there, but it was Kevin who killed Brittany and Nikki, and he didn't do anything. He did nothing to stop it, which was why he was very upset and made that phone call to the Culvers. Once investigators knew this information, they immediately began to search the apartment. And it revealed several things that were taken from Nikki and Brittany's apartment. Antoine was wearing Nikki Silas's sweatshirt from the University of Massachusetts. Now, Kevin, he wasn't at home on the day that they arrested Antoine. And they didn't want to give any tips that Antoine had been arrested. They didn't want to make a big deal out of the arrest. They decided to do a stakeout of the apartment, hoping to find Kevin and to catch him off guard. Kevin Ladison carried himself as a successful young man, at least on the outside. However, he had a record. He had served time upstate on a gun charge. It wasn't too far off that he could be responsible for for the murders. The stakeout was successful and they found Kevin and they took him into custody. He went willingly. Detectives still had the sketch that Daniel provided. They compared it to Kevin. It matched him to a T. But Kevin said he had no idea who Nikki or Brittany was. And when they confronted him with information that Antoine provided that he did in fact know Brittany and Nikki and he was responsible for killing him, he still didn't flinch. He's continued to deny that he had anything to do with the murders. He claimed on the night of the murder, he went to a club, went back home where he slept until 2 p.m. The two detectives decided to play bad cop, good cop. One cop played exhausted from dealing with Kevin continuously saying he had nothing to do with the murders, and he left the room very upset. The second detective, however, decided to do the good cop. He told a lie, but a lie that would be beneficial in the end. He said that he was a preacher in his spare time, and they discovered that he had become a Muslim when he served time upstate. He played on the spirituality. He said, I'm a preacher when I'm not a police officer. And it's so important that we do the right thing because confession is good for the soul. And although you're not a Christian, I want to appeal to your spirituality. It's good to just get things off your chest. Tell us the truth. What happened? And that's when Kevin tells them a story. He states the exact opposite of what Antoine Atterbury said. He said that, yes, I was at Brittany and Nikki's apartment, but I was not responsible for their murders. It was Antoine. Detectives really had to dig deep in their detective bag and figure out who was providing accurate information. And they turned to DNA. They were able to take a sample from each man, and it was Kevin's DNA that matched the rape kit taken from Nikki. They tried Kevin as the killer and Antoine as the accomplice. Kevin Ladison was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder, rape, burglary, and theft related to the items taken from the apartment. Antoine was charged with burglary for participating in entering the apartment and aiding in the robbery. He was considered an accomplice to murder, though not charged with murder itself due to insufficient evidence that he committed the killings directly. There weren't any plea deals on the table, and they both went to trial. They were able to establish the connection between Kevin, Brittany, and Antoine Atterbury and Nikki Silas. The connection was Kevin. Kevin knew Brittany, and him and Brittany had been in some conversations, and he claimed to have a friend, which was Antoine Atterbury, in the industry. We know that is a lie. And he asked if they could all go out on a double date. They did, and the girls allowed Kevin and Antoine to come in their apartment. And eventually they said, are you guys going to go home? And they said, well, we've had too much to drink. Can we just spend the night? Both of the girls obliged, but said that they would have to stay on the couch. Kevin had other ideas. At some point, both girls go into their rooms, but Brittany comes out and goes into the bathroom to take a shower. And that's when Kevin decided to push his way into the bathroom. And they believe that he was wanting to have sex with Brittany. She pushes him off. They get into a struggle. And because there was a struggle, he decides to ultimately just strangle her with the cord in the bathroom. They believe that Antoine heard the entire struggle, but he did nothing. Soon after, Kevin goes into Nikki's room, strangles and rapes her. And then he comes out, he finds the safe, and shortly after, Antoine calls the Culvers. When they don't answer the phone, he's distressed, and he is the person who leaves first, which is why Daniel saw him coming out of the apartment with his hands on his face, appearing to be very distressed. Shortly after, Kevin takes the safe with the money, leaving with the Christmas hat on his head. Kevin Ladison was found guilty and was sentenced to 40 years to life. Antoine was found guilty of his charges and was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Nikki's mother was grief-stricken. It wasn't until she ultimately decided to forgive Kevin Ladison and Antoine Atterbury for killing her daughter that she was able to really move on with her life. She went through a program that encourages offenders to interact with the victim's family. She claimed that she sat in a 2-hour visit along with her husband, and Kevin Ladison appeared to be very remorseful, and she was able to forgive him along with Antoine Atterbury and to find some semblance of justice for the loss of her daughter, Nikki Silas. That is the case of Brittany Rojas and Nikki Silas. Before we get into our reflections for our first case, I want to tell you about another case. I recently just watched a documentary, which I will mention in just a second, but it made such an impact on me that I knew I needed to share it here on Murder in the Black. However, it wasn't enough for a full episode. Not every true crime story is about murder. Sometimes it's a little quieter, and I would say this story probably is a more haunting because it's not about the who done it. It's more about the unnoticed. How a woman could disappear in plain sight for years without anybody noticing. Joyce Carol Vincent was born in Hammersmith, London in 1965. She was the youngest of 5 girls. Her parents were immigrants from the Caribbean who had come to England seeking opportunity. Her mother passed away when she was about 11 years old, and from that moment, her life shifted. Her father, a carpenter, wasn't emotionally close, and Joyce often sought love and belonging outside the home. Still, she grew into a beautiful, well-spoken young woman. People remembered her smile, bright and infectious. She loved music, especially R&B and soul. In her 20s, she worked administrative jobs, including Ernst& Young, one of London's top firms. She had friends, colleagues, and a vibrant social circle. But as the years went by, something changed. In her 30s, Joyce's life became harder to trace. She moved frequently, took on short-term jobs, and gradually lost touch with her family. At one point, she left her job suddenly, telling coworkers she wanted to pursue a new chapter, but she never said what it was. It's later discovered that she spent time in a domestic violence shelter, possibly fleeing an abusive relationship. Those who met her there said she was gentle but withdrawn, as if hiding something or from someone. By 2003, Joyce moved into a small bedsit, a single-room apartment in Wood Green, North London. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the most spectacular thing, but it was hers. No one heard from her. January 25th, 2006, a housing officer arrives at Joyce's flat. Rent wasn't paid, and the mailbox was overflowing. Neighbors were complaining of a smell, but in London, they say that's not unusual. The officer knocked, no one answered, and he entered. Inside, he found a surreal scene. The TV was still on, a stack of mail by the door, and on the couch, the skeletal remains of a woman, Joyce. Around her were wrapped Christmas gifts, perfectly placed, never delivered. Forensic experts estimate that she died December 2003, over 2 years earlier. Imagine that. 2 whole years, her TV flickering, rent automatically paid, lights glowing behind the curtain, a woman who lived in one of the world's busiest cities, gone unnoticed. There was no evidence of foul play, no forced entry. Now, the autopsy suggested she may have suffered from an asthma attack, or there was speculation that she could have died from complications from an ulcer. It was lonely, a quiet death, but the aftermath was anything but silent. When the news broke, the public couldn't believe it. How could someone be dead for years without anyone realizing it? Reporters called it tragedy of modern isolation, a symptom of city life where millions live side by side but truly do not connect. Neighbors said that they assumed she moved out. The smell, they thought it just came from the garbage. Even the landlord believed that she was still there. The rent had been coming through up until when it wasn't. It was the perfect storm of digital autopilot, bills, rent, utilities, all running without human contact. Joyce disappeared in plain sight. A few years later, filmmaker Carol Morley released Dream of a Life, which is what I watched. It was a documentary that tried to piece together who Joyce really was. And through interviews of said friends, colleagues, and past romantic partners, more complex picture emerged. Joyce was described as radiant, the kind of woman who would walk into a room and light it up. She was rumored to date musicians, attend concerts, and as I mentioned before, she loved to sing, but her life was marked by pain, loss, trauma, and the quiet erosion of her connections. One friend recalled, and I quote, "She was the last person you'd ever imagine this happening to." And yet, that's what makes Joyce's story so haunting. It's not about evil lurking in the dark. It's about what happens when no one is looking. Joyce's story is a mystery. In that documentary, which I highly suggest you guys go and checking out, There's a lot of suspicion around her death. We knew that she had asthma. It was rumored that she had an ulcer. But some of the people who were in the documentary suggested that she could have been killed. And to be honest with you, I think that there may be something there. It is a mystery. But how she was killed is not what I want us to necessarily focus on. I think it's a message. It reminds us that connections are not just something nice to have. My sister often says that God does not intend us to walk this journey of life alone. And I wholeheartedly believe that. We're human beings and we are meant to have connections. And isolation can kill us. Connections are essential. Mental health, isolation, and trauma don't always look how we expect. To look at Joyce Vincent, you would never know that she was struggling with anything. She was gorgeous. She had a successful life, good jobs, but she was lonely. This story tells us it's possible to be surrounded by people, but be alone. With that, I do want to talk about the reflections of this very simple but devastating story. Joyce is a reminder that you have to check on the people that you say you care about. Is there a family member that you haven't talked to? Is there someone as the holidays are going by and you realize, man, I've been so busy, I haven't checked in on them? Well, I encourage you to call them up. Check in on them with not just a text message, but call them, see about them. And it's not just checking in on your strong friends. It's just checking in on everybody and even doing a mental check-in with yourself. And although that seems so cliche to say because we hear those idioms all the time, check in on your strong friend, check in, check on people. Yes, you should. But check in on the person that seems okay too, because you never know the quiet struggles that everyone's going through, or they feel like they can't make it to the next moment. The story of Joyce, while not our typical true crime story, is a crime because those people in that documentary, as they talk very fondly of her, you realize that they still didn't check in on her. Somebody they said they cared for and cared about, at least at one point in time. So that is my challenge for you in regards to the story of Joyce. The story of Brittany Rojas and Nikki Silas is one that I think we have discussed on Murder in the Black before. So I won't repeat anything that I feel like I've said in previous cases. But what I will say is that when you decide not to speak up when a crime is taking place or when an injustice, period, is going on in our culture, you are complicit. Your hands are now stained with the blood of others. And in the case of Brittany Rojas and Nikki Silas, that's exactly what took place. Antoine Atterbury, while described as a very nice young man, he didn't have a criminal background. He was still guilty. And I can't say that I'm satisfied with the sentence he received because he was guilty of the murder, in my opinion, because he decided not to say anything. He decided not to do anything. And I know that in that case, him doing something could have cost him his life. But his inability to stand up cost Brittany and Nikki there. So I just want to encourage you that when you do see an injustice, it is not always befitting to just mind your business. When you see something, say something. Another saying that we use often, but it's very true. Because far too often, we're comfortable with just minding our business and allowing evil to prevail. In order for evil to be stopped, someone has to speak out. And in both cases, I think that it is a reminder during the holidays and during the holiday seasons that we have to be intentional with our connections and that connections are, in fact, valuable. Please remember those who have experienced immense tragedy from murder, rape, and victims of other tragic crimes during this particular season. And do me a favor and love those who love you and be kind to everyone. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black.